I am Fernando Maglia from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I am composer and guitarist and professor at the University National of the Arts. Through this message, I have the pleasure of thanking IRCAM, Institut de Recherche et Coordination Acoustique Musique, located in Paris, and especially the ALEA Association and its artistic director Marco Bidin, and his Music for Headphones project, for having commissioned me the composition of an electroacoustic work to be premiered in Paris during the month of July. Said work, which will surely be called Omnia, began to take shape in my mind from the moment the commission came to me, firstly in the form of a brainstorm where various ideas pile up, beginning to try to organize themselves in search of a common thread and a hierarchical order. It is at that moment that the realization of a graphic scheme, shown below, begins to take shape, and from which not only the organization of the various materials but also their syntactic framework should be derived. As a starting point, I can think of a hypothetical confrontation between pre-Columbian America, the stench, and modern and contemporary Europe, 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, the neatness, terminology used by the thinker and philosopher Rodolfo Kusch in his book The Deep America. As the work developed internally, and although the initial approach would be the backbone of the work, I wondered why not to include materials from other cultures in secondary sections such as bridges, transitions, deviations, interpolations, etc. Thus, the work would be conceptually raised as a palimpsest, where it would be written on the semi-erased traces of a previous writing, and its structure defined by a kind of rondo mosaic. As a separate item, it is reasonable to mention the personal path that ends up defining the language, following Kusch's thoughts in which he differentiates between the European being, ser in Spanish, and the Latin American being, estar in Spanish. Argentines are a rare mix between these two qualities. In my specific case, I come from 4 Italian families, jus sanguinis in Latin, but I live in Latin American territory, jus solis in Latin. I do not have a single tradition. We are syncretic beings. Having completed my musical training in Argentina in 1986, I received a scholarship from the French government to do a postgraduate course with the French composer Francis Miroglio. After some time, I recognized that my language was blending with Central Europe's style, something that I didn't dislike. But once back in my country and at the moment of taking a blank page to start a new work, I emphatically question it myself. I am no longer in Paris. I cannot continue doing the same as I did there. This is how I began to investigate everything related to pre-Columbian music and art, guided by the magnificent publications of the musicologists Carlos Vega and Isabel Aretz. The orchestra of autochthonous instruments of Sergio Prudencio in Bolivia, and their thought and, of course, the Bartók figure. It is interesting to note that in Europe, during the first decades, three composers with very different traits clearly prevailed. Igor Stravinsky, with a neoclassical bias and evocative of melodies from the Russian tradition. Arnold Schoenberg and his disciples, Alban Berg and Anton Weber, composers mostly dodecaphonic and encompassing the space of abstraction in music. And finally, Bela Bartók, a root composer, tied to the expressions of his land, elaborated in a very particular language that he himself defined as imaginary folklore. In Latin America, we have three fundamental figures who delved into a folkloric indigenous discourse with the incorporation of a modern and functional orchestration. They were Silvestre Revueltas in Mexico, appealing to the ancient Aztec civilization, Heitor Villalobos, an international figure who spread his works based on Brazilian folklore, and Alberto Ginastera in Argentina, who, taking certain characteristics and rhythms from indigenous folk music, makes great symphonic productions and operas based on regional myths. From that moment, I began to use the rescued examples in written and audio form from these researchers. This material will almost never appear in a literal form, but will be elaborated in different degrees of metaphorization, that is to say, at variable distances from the original, sometimes becoming unrecognizable. European gestures and resources appear coexisting with this material, continually seeking a coherent fusion, a language of synthesis. In the previously mentioned secondary section, I resort to other cultures, such as the African and the Oriental cultures, to broaden not only the cultural range, but also the ostensibly vary the original parameters, harmonies, scales, textures, etc., but also to give it an instrumental richness of different types, colors, which they interact with the original elements.
Yereibchad chaticha, abchad mer sepotjitien tosjatio, rechunynsum ach, Mariev, Shamsu sin hohe,
No sé para qué volví, si yo empezaba a ultimar, no sé si ya lo sabrás.
Setjumst þá rökstólabróðir. Hvað hef ég gjört til að bera svo bága kvenhyrni?